Musicals have been a staple of cinema since the early 1930s. Whether animated or live action, there's just something about people singing and dancing that audiences can't seem to resist. But despite that, the musical fell out of favor in the early 1970s and were never really able to reclaim their former glory, at least in live action. On the animation side of things is another story. But the point is, since the 1970s, successful musicals are a lot more the exception than the rule, with the few that do achieve mainstream notoriety usually being adaptations of Broadway plays. And perhaps one of the most notable examples of that is the 2002 film Chicago, since it actually managed to win Best Picture at the Oscars at a time when most musicals were still pretty rare outside of animation, let alone so critically acclaimed. But despite having such a distinction, the truth is that the movie version of Chicago has very little in common with traditional Hollywood musicals, to the point that some could say it's actually an anti-musical. And today, I'd like to explore this topic to the best of my ability. What exactly is it that makes Chicago such a different musical? And there are obviously going to be spoilers for both the movie and stage versions ahead. So in case you've been meaning to see either one and don't want to know what happens, I would highly recommend you turn off this video. Okay, so just to clarify one thing first, I'm not a movie expert, nor am I a professional film historian. So if you're looking for somebody with a more professional take on this subject, this might not be the video for you. Alright, so with that out of the way, it must first be pointed out that in the most literal sense of the word, Chicago is definitely a musical. The characters frequently break out into song and also do their fair share of dancing as well. So on the surface, it definitely checks all the boxes of being a musical. However, beyond those requirements, it's pretty much the exact opposite of a traditional musical in every regard. And before anybody says it, no. It's not because most of the musical numbers are portrayed as being in Roxy's head rather than the characters randomly just breaking out into song. Musicals that justify the characters singing and dancing within the narrative go all the way back to the golden age of Hollywood, where characters would only sing if there was a logical reason for it. Instead, what makes Chicago so different from other musicals is in something a bit more complicated. That simply put, most musicals are feel-good by nature. Though that being said, there are quite a few that do manage to be bittersweet, or can even be downright depressing right from the beginning. Les Miserables or Sweeney Todd, anyone? And that's not even getting into opera, which is so infamous for its tragic endings that even the likes of Looney Tunes couldn't escape it in one of their most famous cartoons. But the thing is, unlike Chicago, the tragic nature of outright depressing musicals doesn't make them anti-musicals. Because the point of a musical is to use the music to make the audience feel a mood, to put them in a specific frame of mind for the story being told. And in the case of depressing and tragic musicals, that's exactly what the music is used for, to make the audience feel the tragedy of what's going on. And conversely, musicals of a happier nature use their music for the exact same reason, to make the audience feel good about what's going on. But that's not exactly what goes on in Chicago. Because the upbeat, roaring 20s inspired jazz numbers are completely at odds with the story of an amoral, lawless, corrupt city at its absolute lowest point. In other words, the music and the story are completely at odds with each other. And that's such a rare thing that even seemingly similar musicals like Cabaret don't achieve this. Because sure, the music itself doesn't always fit the mood of the story, but the songs still tell you everything you need to know about the state of Germany and the path that it's quickly going down with each passing number. So even if the music may not be in line with previous or future scenes, the numbers do still ultimately set the right mood as far as how political events are shaping up. But once again, that's not how Chicago works. Because if anything, the music is instead used to highlight just how bad the characters are against how good the music is. Like, take the famous Cell Block Tango, for example. It may be a catchy earworm that you can't stop listening to, but when you look past that, the song is ultimately about a bunch of women who murdered men for reasons that honestly didn't deserve it. I mean, sure, in a couple of cases they had the right to be upset, but none of it warranted murder, especially in such brutal ways. But because the music is so upbeat, catchy, and epic, most aren't even apt to realize just what they're listening to until they've heard it a few times. Or take the opening number, All That Jazz. Such a catchy, roaring 20s jingle that Catherine Zeta-Jones turned down the lead role so she could sing it. One is liable to forget the actual context of the song due to the putting you in the mood for a party vibe that it sets. Because in actuality, this woman has just murdered her husband and sister, who was her partner in the act, no less. She's even shown washing the blood off her hands right before she goes out on stage. So the fact that this woman can go out and give such a perfect performance of a catchy and sensuous song highlights just how much of a sociopath she really is. She clearly doesn't care about anything except her own career and satisfying her ego, which is only compounded by the fact that she opts to finish the song rather than run when the police come for her. And what's also flashing on screen as Velma sings this song? Roxy cheating on her husband. To put it simply, the mood the song itself sets and the actual context behind it being sung are completely at odds with each other and show just how disturbing the whole thing really is. And sure enough, Velma's behavior in this scene does end up foreshadowing both how nasty and self-serving she really is. And that's what really makes Chicago different from other musicals. Because whether a musical is feel-good or a tragedy, ultimately the goal is to make the audience feel for the characters and share their mindset. But in Chicago, the songs never really serve that purpose, as there's honestly nobody for the audience to root for. Velma is, as I just described, ultimately a selfish sociopath who only helps others if it suits her, and Roxy is only marginally sympathetic by comparison. Because while she does come across as a bit naive and not exactly the smartest, ultimately she is still pretty apathetic and callous towards the people she's hurt and loves indulging in delusions of grandeur. Those are our two main characters. And there's really nobody else to alleviate this, as Mama is a prison warden, all the prisoners are murderers, the press is simply looking for a sensational story, the prosecution comes across as way too irrationally vindictive, and perhaps the biggest offender of all, Billy Flynn. The textbook example of everything people hate in lawyers. This is a man that only cares about lining his own pockets and doesn't care what he has to do or who he has to let off in order to achieve that. Some might argue that his more world-weary moments hint that he may actually hate himself for what he's doing, but even if that is true, that doesn't change the fact that this man is ultimately a crook who belongs in jail right alongside the very people he defends. Again, it's attorneys like him that give his profession a bad name, and not undeservingly at that. So in the end, the only two characters that the audience can sympathize with is the Hungarian prisoner, because she's innocent, and Amos, Roxy's husband. And that's why he's such a fan favorite, because he's one of the only characters that the viewer can genuinely root for and sympathize with. But ultimately, one ends up hanged for a crime she didn't commit, and the other is left disappointed and divorced. While on the flip side, pretty much everybody else gets what they wanted. The press got their story, Flynn got his money and won both cases, as well as stayed out of jail, and not only did Velma and Roxy get away with cold-blooded murder, but they also became the sensations they always wanted in the process. Again, when you really look at it, this story is actually a very disturbing one, but the music helps mask it. And that's what makes Chicago an anti-musical. Because instead of the music helping the audience get in the mood of and understand the characters, it instead does the exact opposite, setting up a fun mood while telling a completely nihilistic story. And once again, because of that, you've got a cheerful musical score as the backdrop for two murderesses using a crooked lawyer to get off scot-free for their actions. Now it would be one thing if the characters didn't get away with it in the end and were instead found guilty of murder, as the upbeat score would ultimately be appropriate because they got what was coming to them, similar to the stage version of Little Shop of Horrors. But it's the fact that the exact opposite happens that makes Chicago such a rarity among musicals. The mood the songs set and the actual story are complete opposites and can leave the audience not knowing how to feel about what they're seeing. But that's also the whole point. I mean, how else could one tell a story of this nature and keep the audience from not caring about what happens? I mean, I did do a video on just that, which you can find a link in the description to, but the point still stands. Because what a lot of people don't know about this movie, as well as the play it was based on, is that all of the characters were based on real-life people in 1920s Chicago. There were even a couple of plays and movies that took inspiration from those same events long before the play Chicago was ever conceived, with one of the most notable being the 1942 film Roxy Hart. And their final fates do more or less reflect what actually happened to them, though for what it's worth, Roxy's real-life equivalent died only 4 years after her trial of tuberculosis. But either way, the reason the musical is so dark and gritty is because it was based on events that actually happened in the 1920s when the city was at its most corrupt. And the jazzy musical score is there not only to reflect the era it takes place in, but also to keep it from being so dark and nihilistic that the audience just stops caring entirely. But that still doesn't change the fact that the main purpose behind a musical is to make the audience feel what the characters do, and that's exactly the opposite of what Chicago does. And to be the opposite of that is to be an anti-musical. And as I noted at the beginning, that's actually a very rare thing to do, since most musicals, no matter their format, do tend to do their job of getting the audience to form a deeper connection to the characters and further understand them. So whether or not you believe it deserves the title of Best Picture, one can't deny that all these factors certainly make Chicago stand out as one of the most unique musicals ever written. Alright, I think that's everything I wanted to cover. So now why don't all of you tell me? Do you believe Chicago is an anti-musical based off the way its musical score contrasts with the personality and actions of the characters? Or do you think it's just an ordinary musical and that I don't know what I'm talking about? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because as I always say, you don't have to agree with anything I said if you don't want to. You can feel about Chicago any way you want to, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is perfectly fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all very much appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.